Hello, Angel. Back for another installment. This is Chapter 6, Islandwe. Terran came to his senses on a pile of dirty straw, which smelled as though Gurgi and all his ancestors had slept on it. A few feet above him, pale yellow sunlight shone through the grating. The feeble beam ended abruptly on a wall of rough, damp stone. The shadows of bars lay across a tiny patch of light. Instead of brightening the cell, the wan rays made it appear only more grim and closed in. As Terran's eyes grew accustomed to this yellow twilight, he made out a heavy, studded portal with a slot at the base. The cell itself was not over 3 paces square. His head ached. Since his hands were still bound behind him, he could do no more than guess at the large, throbbing lump. What had happened to Gwydion he dared not imagine. After Cauldron warriors had struck him, Terran had regained consciousness only a few moments before slipping once again into the whirling darkness. In that brief time, he vaguely remembered opening his eyes and finding himself slung over a guard's back. His confused recollection included a dim corridor with doors on either side. Gwydion had called out to him once, or so Terran believed. He could not recall his friend's words, perhaps even that it had been part of a nightmare. He supposed Gwydion had been cast into another dungeon. Terran fervently hoped so. He could not shake off the memory of Akron's livid face and her horrible screaming, and he feared she might have ordered Gwydion slain. Still, there is no good reason to hope his companion had lived. Akron could easily have cut his throat as he braved her in the council hall, yet she had held back. Thus, she intended to keep Gwydion alive. Perhaps, Terran thought wretchedly, Gwydion would be better off dead. The idea of this proud figure lying a broken corpse filled Terran with grief that quickly turned to rage. He staggered to his feet, lurched to the door, kicking it, battering himself against it with what little strength remained in him. In despair, he sank to the damp ground, his head pressed against the unyielding oaken planks. He rose again after a few moments and kicked at the walls. If Gwydion were, by chance, in an adjoining cell, Terran hoped he would hear his signal. But he judged from the dull and muffled sound that the walls were too thick for his feeble tapping to penetrate. As he turned away, a flashing object fell through the grating and dropped to the stone floor. Terran stooped. It was a ball of what seemed to be gold. Perplexed, he looked upward. From the grating, a pair of intensely blue eyes looked back at him. "Please," said a little girl's voice, light and musical, "my name is Islandwe, and, if you don't mind, would you throw my bauble to me? I don't want you to think I'm a baby, playing with a silly bauble, because I'm not. But sometimes there's absolutely nothing else to do around here, and it slipped out of my hand when I was tossing it." "Little girl," Terran interrupted. But I am not a little girl," Islandwe protested. "Haven't I just finished telling you? Are you slow-witted? I am so sorry for you. It's terrible to be dull and stupid. What's your name?" she went on. "It makes me feel funny not knowing someone's name. Wrong-footed, you know, or as if I had 3 thumbs on one hand, if you see what I mean. It's clumsy." "I am Terran of Caer-Dalben," Terran said. Then he wished he had not. This, he realized, could be another trap. "That's lovely," Islandwe said gaily. "I'm very glad to meet you. I suppose you're a lord, or a warrior, or a war leader, or a bard, or a monster? Though we haven't had any monsters for a long time." "I am none of those," said Terran, feeling quite flattered that Islandwe should have taken for any one of those. "What else is there?" "I am an assistant pig-keeper," Terran said. He bit his lip as soon as the words were out. Then, to excuse his loose tongue, told himself it could do no harm for this girl to know that much. "How fascinating," Islandwe said. "You're the first we've ever had, unless that poor fellow in the other dungeon is one too." "Tell me of him," Terran said quickly. "Is he alive?" "I don't know," said Islandwe. "I peeked through the grating, but I couldn't tell. He doesn't move at all. But I should imagine he is alive, otherwise Akron would have fed him to the ravens. Now please, if you don't mind, it's right at your feet." "I can't pick up your bauble," Terran said, "because my hands are tied." The blue eyes looked surprised. "Oh, well, that would account for it then. I suppose I shall have to come in and get it." "You can't come in and get it," Terran said wearily. "Don't you see I'm locked up here?" Of course I do, said Islandwy. What would be the point of having someone in a dungeon if they weren't really locked up? Really, Taryn of Caradalben, you surprise me with some of your remarks. I don't mean to hurt your feelings by asking, but is assistant pig-keeper the kind of work that calls for a great deal of intelligence? Something beyond the grating and out of Taryn's vision swooped down, and the blue eyes disappeared suddenly. Taryn heard what looked to be a scuffle, then a high-pitched little shriek followed by a larger shriek, and in a moment or two a loud smacking. The blue eyes did not reappear. Taryn flung himself back onto the straw, and after a time, in the dreadful silence and loneliness of the tiny cell, he began to wish Islandwy would come back. She was a most confusing person that he had ever met, and surely as wicked as everyone else in this castle, although he could not quite bring himself to believe it completely. Nevertheless, he longed for the sound of another voice, even Islandwy's prattling. The grating above his head darkened. Night poured into the cell in a black, chilly wave. The slot in the heavy portal rattled open. Taryn heard something being slid into the cell and crawled toward it. It was a shallow bowl. He sniffed carefully and finally ventured to touch his tongue to it, fearing all the while that it might be poisoned food. It was not food at all, but only a little water, warm and musty. His throat was so parched that Taryn disregarded the taste, thrust his face down into the bowl, and drank it dry. He curled up and tried to sleep his pain away. The tight thongs pinched, but his swollen hands were mercifully numb. Sleep brought only nightmares, and he roused himself to find himself shouting aloud. He settled down once more. Now there was a rasping sound under the straw. Taryn stumbled to his feet, and the rasping grew louder. "Move away!" cried a faint voice. Taryn looked around him dumbfounded. "Get off the stone!" He stepped backwards. The voice was coming from the straw. "Well, I can't lift it with you standing on it, silly assistant pig-keeper," the muffled voice complained. Frightened and puzzled, Taryn jumped to the wall. The pallet began rising upward. A loose flagstone was lifted, pushed aside, and a slender shadow emerged from the ground itself. "Who are you?" Taryn shouted. "Who did you expect?" said Islandwy.